When you do a lot of polygon modeling, you quickly realize that what you do for the most amount of time is actually defining what you want to work with, or in other words, making component selections of either faces, of vertices, or of edges. Now, of course, such simple selections are easy to make, but in many cases you might be working with highly complex models and meshes, and some of the components might be hard to see or hard to select, or just very time consuming to select for whatever reason. So the selections that you make represent a certain investment in time and money, so you don't want those selections to get lost or Maya to forget about these selections. So what you can always do, of course, is go ahead and enter the create menu, and under sets create a quick select set of the components that you have currently selected, which you can then find in, as a set, and that you can always go back in and select set members for. But you have to do this manually, and you shouldn't forget about doing this in the first place. In order not having to do this manually, we have added a new function to Ritalin for Maya, which is called Ritalin Remember Polygon Component Selections. So when this is on, whenever you make a selection of any of the subcomponents of a polygon mesh, for example vertices, and do an actual selection, you can either go back to object mode, move your stuff around, do whatever you want to do, and then later go back into vertex selection mode, and the vertices that were previously selected will be reselected for you, no matter how it looked like. The same goes for faces. So when you select faces, go back to vertices, the vertices are selected, go back to faces, your previous face selection is enabled again. And the same way for edges, select some edges, back to faces, back to vertices, back to edges. So whatever you select, your last component selection is always restored for your current component type. This also works across multiple objects. So for example, when you duplicate this one, just move it over here, select both, go back to vertices, you will see that also the information has been copied over. So you can, of course, select across multiple objects, go back to faces, go back to vertices again, and your vertex selection is still there. One thing worth mentioning is that you don't need to use the right mouse button menu all the time to switch between your components. You can also do this in the component selection filter directly, for example, when I selected some edges, and then go back to my vertices. They are still there. When I go back to edges, the edges that I just selected are again restored. However, restoring a selection only works with the right mouse button menu. You can click on vertices, for example, as you see, the selection is not restored. That only happens through the right mouse button menu. The other thing worth mentioning is that the default Maya behavior of switching between object and component selection mode up here is slightly changed. For example, when you only have one object selected and we disable the Remember Polygon component selections option, we get the default Maya behavior, which is when you right click on an object and choose to select edges, for example, you will notice that the component selection mode does not automatically switch over to the component selection filter, which means that you still can select your stuff normally, and you can even select also edges on a second object, but the moment you want to select components over several objects at once, you will see that it always only selects the components on one object. So this is actually pretty annoying. I don't know why it was chosen to implement it that way. With Remember Polymesh component selections enabled, the behavior is slightly different in that when we are in object mode and we choose to go to vertex mode, you see that the component selection filter mode is changed to the component type and does not stay in object type. So in this case, we can also add another object to the selection, and now we are perfectly able to select similar components across multiple separate objects, which is, I think, a bit more convenient and probably more along the lines of what you would normally expect in such a case. Lastly, polygon selections are actually pretty resilient. So in this case, we have two objects with stored component selections. What we can do is we can, for example, combine these two objects into one polymesh object, and when we now go back to, for example, vertices, my selection is still here. Same goes for edges and of course for faces. Also, when you save the scene and load it back in, each object that had component selection stored still remembers them, so the selection data is saved with the scene. Technically, component selections are stored by blind data nodes per object. You can actually see these nodes when you disable the DAG objects only option. When you scroll down a little, you can see that there is one blind data node per component type per object stored in the scene, which is also the reason why you can save the file, load it later, and stored component selections are still there, which is also the reason why you can combine separate meshes into one mesh and the data is still there. If for whatever reason you want to get rid of these nodes at whatever point, you can use function remove stored component selections. It will delete any blind data node associated with stored component selections from your scene, from every object. I think that pretty much covers everything there is to say about this new feature. Hope you find it as useful as I do. Thanks for watching.